afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Global Markets Theater. For those of you just joining us, welcome to day 3 of the Global Wind Energy Council's Global Market Theater, which is kindly sponsored today by Choreo Generation. We are now going to hold what we like to call a working lunch session. So the idea is that we've put out some sandwiches, we've put out some beverages at the back of the theater, and what we encourage you to do is just to grab a snack and grab a comfortable seat and enjoy the panel that we have lined up for you today. What we'll be talking about for the next 45 minutes is the challenging condition that we're all facing around an energy security crisis and a climate crisis that have converged in the last 12 months, particularly exacerbated by the invasion of Ukraine. And we have with us today a very special guest who's going to speak about the invasion of Ukraine and the impact on the Ukrainian wind energy industry, after which we'll talk about how the invasion has impacted the wider global wind industry, especially in terms of how energy supply tightness and energy affordability concerns are impacting the growth of wind. So first, to give our keynote presentation, I'd like to invite to the stage Galina Schmidt, who's a board member of the Ukrainian Wind Energy Association and has kindly traveled from Kiev to be with us here in Hamburg today. Please give Galina a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. Dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I would like to take this chance to express my gratitude to the organizers of this event for inviting us and also for your support to Ukraine. I would like to start my today's presentation by quoting the words of our President Volodymyr Zelensky. Ukraine has a huge natural potential for the development of capacities in green energy and in the production of green hydrogen. This is a potential of at least tens and possible hundreds of gigawatts of green electrical power and millions of tons of green hydrogen. The Russian invasion has exposed the vulnerability of Ukraine's current energy system, heavily dominated with fossil fuel power plants, nuclear and thermal. Russia knows about our reliance on fossil and nuclear power, and that makes our energy system a special target for the new attacks, both hybrid and direct. Russia's seizure of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, recent missile strikes on the South Ukrainian nuclear power plant shows that Putin is ready to use nuclear terrorism as an act of the war. At the same time, I'd like to say that Ukraine has made a significant renewable energy progress in the recent years. As of the end of 2021, the installed renewable capacity in Ukraine amounted to 1.7 gigawatts. The current green power sector of Ukraine is mainly represented by solar and wind power plants, and so far significant capacities of bioenergy and small hydropower plants. Since 2004, there has been no new fossil fuel generating capacity added to the grid, while renewables, on the contrary, has brought to Ukraine more than 1 billion euros of direct investments over the past 10 years. Ukraine has excellent wind resources to ensure the widespread deployment on wind power. We have vast territories suitable for wind development. As of the end of 2021, there were 34 wind farms operating in Ukraine. Almost 359 megawatts of wind capacity were added to the grid, bringing the cumulative total to almost 1.7 gigawatts. more than 3 billion euros have been already invested in wind projects in Ukraine. Russia's military aggression has inflicted considerable damage on the whole energy sector. Energy infrastructure facilities, such as power plants, high-voltage grids, transformers, and substations, has been systematically shelled and destroyed by Russian troops since the very first days of the war. Russia's aggression and temporary occupation of some territories of Ukraine deprived the country of a significant part of the green generation. Unfortunately, most of the areas of active hostilities are where the best solar and wind resources are located. Last year, renewable generated 80% of Ukraine's electricity consumption, while this year the green generation of electricity has already decreased by a third. In general, about 20% of all renewable capacities have been stopped or damaged. This chart shows you the number of capacities being under operation. They are marked in black, and stopped or damaged marked in red. Russia's war on Ukraine has shut down about 80% of all Ukrainian wind farms. We know about at least 7 wind turbines being struck in the course of the war, but the real number could be much higher. Right now, the wind farms operators and owners have no access to the wind sites in the areas controlled by Russian invaders. To counter the effects of the Russian invasion, the energy community has set up an energy support fund for Ukraine. Consolidated funds are used to restore energy infrastructure that has been damaged or destroyed as a result of hostilities in Ukraine. The Ministry of Energy of Ukraine coordinates the request of Ukrainian companies for the relevant restoration work. The invasion highlights the urgent need for Ukraine to reduce its dependence on fossil fuel. Instead of building back the fossil-fueled energy infrastructure, we should take this calamitous opportunity for transition to green, homegrown, sustainable energy from renewables. I'd like to quote the EC Commissioner for Energy, Kadri Simpson. We don't just want to rebuild the Ukrainian energy system of the past. We want to build it back better than before, with 2 main goals in mind: Ukraine energy independence and decarbonization. The rapid expansion of wind and solar is the key to increase Ukraine's energy security. Post-war recovery of Ukraine should be based on renewables with wind power at its core. As our president noted, Ukraine can maximize its potential of green power. This is confirmed by Ukraine Recovery Plan by 2032, presented by the Ukrainian government this summer in Lugano. The plans provide for the construction of 5 to 10 gigawatts of wind and solar capacities, and plus additional 30 gigawatts of green energy capacities for renewable hydrogen production by 2032. In general, investments in energy independence of Ukraine and its green transition are estimated at 130 billion euros. Bilateral cooperation facilitated by and supported by the European Commission, Energy Community Secretariat, and NTSOE will assist in post-war recovery of Ukrainian economy, with focus on ensuring energy security and advancing European and Ukrainian decarbonization goals. 2022 could have been another record year for Ukraine's wind power sector, with annual wind additions of about 1 gigawatt, according to the forecast we, as Ukrainian Wind Energy Association, made at the end of 2021. But the war changed all our plans, and currently all the projects that were already in construction phase have been put on hold. But at the same time, their construction could be resumed very quickly. Considering the loss of control over the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, Ukraine may face a shortage of generation this winter. Therefore, it's critically important to complete construction of the wind farm to compensate for the possible power shortfalls. Here you see the list of wind projects that have been at the different stages of construction before the war starts. Ukraine needs European help to recover our economy, to rapidly electrify our energy system, to develop renewable hydrogen technologies and offshore wind. This will require real technological and industrial partnership between Ukraine and the EU. We need more interconnectors to boost our capacity to transmit and trade green power from Ukraine and the rest of Europe. The EU-Ukrainian collaboration will open up opportunities for the whole Europe as well. Europe's demand for green energy is only growing. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, it has cut gas supplies to a number of the European countries to make it more difficult for the EU countries to build up reserves ahead of winter. Ukraine's electricity could be a direct replacement for Russian gas, and by exploiting its full potential, let's say expected at the level of 1.7 gigawatt, the European Union could replace up to 6 billion cubic meters of Russian gas. This fact opens up even more prospects for export of green electricity produced in Ukraine. Other than doubling the electricity export, Ukraine can also play a role in the field of renewable energy sources as well. And EU has already identified Ukraine as one of the key partners in the development of hydrogen economy. With the transition to renewable energy, energy itself will cease to be an instrument of political or military influence of one country on another. For sure, to deliver this target, we require huge investments. But investing in Ukraine wind power sector, investing in Ukraine means investing in Ukrainian and European energy security. Wind power means peace and democracy. Glory to Ukraine. Thank you.
Many thanks to Galina Schmidt for that very stark reminder of what's at stake when we speak about energy security and the importance of energy independence today. And I think I speak for everyone when I say we're very grateful that you were able to travel here safely from Kiev to join us in person, along with the chair of the Ukraine Wind Energy Association, Andrei, and the rest of the team at the booth over here, just beside our Global Markets Theater. So what I'd like to do now is briefly talk about the wider impacts of the invasion of Ukraine and other external events that have happened around the world in the last year on our industry, especially when it comes to these themes of energy security and accelerating wind energy deployment to mitigate climate change. if I could just have the presentation on screen. To introduce myself first, my name is Joyce Lee. I'm Head of Policy and Projects at the Global Wind Energy Council, which is a nonprofit industry association that promotes wind power around the world and represents the full value chain of the industry. As Galina laid out in very real terms on the ground in Ukraine, there are now new challenges that have been presented to the industry from the very harrowing material challenges of destroyed infrastructure to the ongoing challenge of encouraging stability to welcome new investment for the wind pipeline in the future. And in the backdrop of the invasion, we're also seeing what looks like very difficult conditions for the industry. So we spoke a little bit about this morning at our COP27 session, where we acknowledged that many countries around the world, especially in the global south, are facing rising national debt burdens. Many regions of the world, including Europe, are facing inflation that has increased to the highest level we've seen in the last few decades. And at the same time, we emitted more carbon last year than we have globally as a planet than we have ever before, according to the IPCC. And that means we really have this narrowing time window in front of us to keep a 1.5-degree pathway alive under the Paris Agreement. These conditions have led to some response packages which have provided some promising signs of light. I think the two major packages that have been recognized at this conference are the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which has really put a strong bet on renewable energy to create this kind of Build Back Better infrastructure plan for the US. And of course, Repower EU, the framework that came out earlier this summer, which similarly bets on wind and solar power in particular to revive the European economy and to ensure that European energy security and independence will be at the heart of the energy system of the future. But these response packages have only gone so far to date to attenuate these challenges like rising inflation, which continues to be experienced, especially around the supply chain in the wind industry, which is experiencing a period of tightness. And for economies that are looking at a very tough winter ahead, where prices for basic commodities and prices for electricity have risen over the last year. I think from December last year to March this year, European households were looking at electricity bills that were 2/3 higher just over the course of those 3 to 4 months. And heading into a winter with supply tightness when it comes to energy supply, that trend does not look like it will stop within the next few months. There have also been a few different events from the Suez Canal crisis last year to the post-industrial recovery from COVID-19 that have also pushed up prices for manufacturing and for key commodities that affect the wind industry, from commodities like steel, copper, and nickel, to the rare earth elements that are required for some of our direct drive turbines like neodymium and dysprosium. So just to illustrate this situation, what we call the symptoms of the twin crises of energy security and climate change, we have a few graphs here on the left. This is showing over the last year spot prices for crude oil, which is in blue, as well as for natural gas, which is in orange. And you can really see the volatility that we've experienced, that we've been exposed to, rather, over the last year, with a high spike around the summer of 2022, a slight drop for natural gas, but then going right back to a spike as we head into the winter. And I think recent events this week around Nord Stream pipeline are going to continue to challenge the market, and we're seeing this play out in real time as we speak today. On the right-hand side, we see a few graphs from the World Bank Commodities Outlook report earlier this year, which are placing side by side some of the key commodities I spoke about. So on the top, you can see the price of aluminum, has really tripled, more than tripled, gone up by 3.5 times actually, from 2019 to 2022, following the trend of the natural gas price rising to the same degree. And on the bottom, you can see copper prices have also more than doubled over the same period of time from 2019 to 2022. And you can see that this situation about manufacturing competition and supply chain tightness is reflected in the red line on the bottom chart, which is representing the global manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index. So you can see that activity has really ramped up as the pandemic has eased in countries around the world. What does that mean for wind? Well, facing this situation, it doesn't change what we need to do to close the gap between what we're building currently and what we need to build by the end of the decade to meet a net zero trajectory, to get on the right pathway for net zero by 2050. So we were at about 95 gigawatts of onshore and offshore wind installations last year, and we need to be closer to around 390 gigawatts of annual installations by 2030 on a global basis. That figure comes from the IEA's net zero roadmap, which lays out an outline for a net zero system by 2050, which sees global wind energy providing around 1/3 of clean electricity around the world by the time we reach 2050. And so the question this poses to us here today, here as an industry, I think for the next few months as well, is how can we effectively respond to these twin crises of energy security and climate change. I think not just in the context of countries which are truly suffering from the impacts of energy insecurity, but also on a global basis as an industry. And in terms of our response, how do we translate that into actions that each of us can try to work towards on a short-term and mid-term basis? And this is what GWEC has tried as a trade body to approach as our responsibility, our question to answer. We started with a large stakeholder consultation process held earlier this year with quite a wide group of organizations that you can see here, including think tanks, energy authorities, industry companies, consultancies that specialize in power market design and more. About 30+ organizations took part in this workshop, which really became a brain trust for the industry to try to create an action plan to respond to the twin crises. And what we distilled from this workshop is broken down to these 5 action areas, so what we call our 5-point plan for the wind industry to accelerate renewables deployment in response to these crises. And I won't go through each of these 5 action areas in detail, but let me tell you about each one very briefly. So first, this one I don't think is a state secret at this point on day 3. We've probably touched on permitting at each session in the Global Markets Theater, but that's done for a reason. So at the top of our list is the need to urgently streamline permitting for wind projects, which can serve to produce a huge increase in the volume of onshore and mainly onshore wind energy, but also offshore in the next 1 to 3 years, and create a project pipeline which is more compatible with a net zero pathway. There's some 600 gigawatts of what we call shovel-ready projects for wind energy identified around the world, which could be brought to market even sooner, which could be brought to FID within the next few years if permitting schemes and frameworks were shortened and were simplified. And I think this goes back to Galina's presentation, identifying the ready-to-build wind pipeline in Ukraine once the situation stabilizes and the investment environment is open again. Second, of course, is grid integration, so the need to get some real substantive grid access action plans in place on a country level in order to get these large volumes of renewable energy connected. And so these will cover things like priority dispatch for renewable energy, ensuring grid connection decisions are made in a timely fashion, especially in parallel with permitting processes, providing incentives for public and/or private investment in transmission infrastructure, and ensuring that planning is based around a future system of a modern, flexible grid which can manage and store and optimally deliver renewable energy. Third is to simplify the mechanisms for procurement and pricing, and we've seen this conversation tick up in terms of the volume around market design issues in the last few weeks, especially in the EU. But the need to look at whether auction schemes are functioning well on a country basis or whether they're functioning on what we've identified as a stop-start cycle. So you see some few hundred megawatts connected one year, and then the pipeline goes quiet for the next few years, and you have a very fallow period for investment. We need to stop these cycles and return to a more continuous rolling cycle for procurement that ensures renewable energy has a visible high-volume pipeline ahead. Fourth is, of course, avoiding the temptation to lock in fossil fuel-based generation and subsidies for generation in the current crisis. There will, of course, be some transition-related measures required for energy security purposes and to keep the lights on, but to avoid creating stranded investment assets where possible. And then fifth, of course, is around encouraging a healthy supply chain development. So that means energy transition plans which are holistic and not just focus on renewable energy targets, but also look at industrial development, planning pathways, creating industrial clusters, revitalizing communities of need with inward investment and job creation brought by the industry. And this is the last slide before we jump into our panel session, which is really a call to action for policymakers in this 5-point plan to be more collaborative around the energy transition. So it's about mainstreaming energy transition objectives and renewable energy objectives across several portfolios. In this morning's session, we recognize that the role of energy in terms of state planning, in terms of state security, has a new prominence that it's gained over the last year, that it's become part of a head of state portfolio. And that means that it needs to be mainstreamed across a trade portfolio, a Ministry of Energy portfolio, tax, industrial development, workforce planning, looking at the transport and logistics and infrastructure planning of a country, and much more. And so I think the only thing I can leave you with is to please visit the GWEC website to download our 5-point plan. We published this in July, and I think given the sustained situation of rising inflation and debt and the energy insecurity that we're facing as we head into the winter, this 5-point plan does have some longevity and will be our piece to present on behalf of the global wind industry to policymakers around the world for the next few months, perhaps for the next year. So take this as an open invitation to please view this report, and hopefully we can have a great discussion now, diving a bit deeper into the content. And if you're interested to learn more, of course, you can approach us afterwards at the GWEC stand just behind the Global Markets Theater. So at this stage, I'd like to move into our next segment of the session, which is to invite back on stage Galina Schmidt from the Ukrainian Wind Energy Association, as well as Rina Bola-Zeller, Senior Specialist of Global Public Affairs at Vestas, to talk a little bit more about the energy security situation in Ukraine, in Europe, and in the world, and hopefully find some silver linings today. Please give them a warm welcome. So thank you so much to both of you for joining me on stage. I'm very excited to have a prominent women-led panel here. It's a very nice occasion to do this for the Global Markets Theater. I'd like to start first with going back to Galina on the energy security picture in Ukraine. And you mentioned the difficult winter ahead and the energy shortages that are likely going to be faced by the population in Ukraine. So can you give us a little bit more color around what the expectations are for energy security as we head into the winter? And having colleagues gathered here from across the industry, are there any actions that we can take as an industry to support our colleagues in Ukraine in this time?
Yeah, thank you. The main challenge is for sure is to guarantee or let's say to ensure the uninterrupted power supplies to Ukrainians. When I'm talking about power, I mean electricity and heat supply as well. And for sure, it is a very big challenge now for my country, especially for the eastern part of Ukraine, which is now mainly destroyed by the Russian invaders. But nevertheless, with the help of European countries, I have already mentioned the Energy Community Secretariat Fund that any country or let's say any private companies can donate either money or some special equipment for Ukraine, let's say to repair, because the main problem right now, each day our electricity workers, they have to repair a lot of kilometers of electricity lines, as well as substations and some other electrical infrastructure of my country. So this is the main, most urgent issue right now. If we are talking a little bit further, I mean, not just for these several months, but let's say for the next year, for sure, we will need more, let's say, help from European countries. As I have already said, investing in Ukraine means also investing in European security, because we, especially as Wind Association, we are just, I would say, insisting on repairing the Ukraine based on renewables with wind at its core. So that I would say this is very briefly about the current situation. I mean, few months ahead the winter. But for sure, we will manage. You know, Ukrainians, we will manage.
Thank you so much, Galina. And it's good to hear the show of strength for your team, for the situation in Ukraine at the end of your intervention. I'd like to look more at the EU-wide lens now. So turning to you, Rina, on the recent reforms that we've seen unrolled, let's say to be implemented, but at least announced on an EU-wide basis when it comes to the energy security situation and the energy cost situation. So how have you seen these reforms start to impact either investment sentiment in the EU market or start to impact electricity, the electricity markets themselves?
Actually, it's not just that the EU intervened to push member states. It's rather the reverse. Member states were pushing the European Commission to do something. And also because there was a growing recognition that if member states in Europe take each and every one their own measures, we might end up with a situation even worse. What is the issue actually? We have an increasing energy and electricity demand and decreasing or not enough pace with the build-out of renewable energy capacity. Hence, we have a supply shortfall. And this was amplified with the Russian invasion and afterwards a stop with gas flows, that we now risk having physical shortages. And it is clear that governments across Europe and actually across the world, because the gas crisis is now a global crisis, are in need or called up to do something to protect the vulnerable population. The question is just how to do it. And there's a big concern that some of the measures, if they were implemented, like, for example, price caps, could result in actually not reducing demand further and then resulting in real physical shortages. Or if you install price caps in one country, but electricity can flow to the neighboring country, then you would risk having physical electricity shortages in one country and companies making windfall profits by exporting the electricity towards the higher priced markets. Hence, it's very, very much important that whatever measures are going to be decided tomorrow, that they are EU-wide, temporary, and that they are not detracting the investment climate for renewables. We don't know how much time this crisis will last, but I think it would be optimistic to say that this will be over in January or February. So we need really to ensure that the investment climate and appetite for more renewables is helping us. And this is also, on the longer term, the only way going towards an increased energy security. And the best thing that governments could do today would be to actually do everything they can to reduce demand. What we don't use today, we can use it tomorrow.
Thanks, Rina. So a very strong intervention there around energy efficiency measures at an EU-wide level being crucial to mitigate the crisis. I do want to note that we call this a working lunch session, so we do want to hear from our audience as well. This isn't just a conversation for us three on stage. If you do have a question for our panelists, for Galina from the Ukrainian Wind Energy Association, or for Rina from Vestas, please do raise your hand. We have some spotters in the back of the room who will run a microphone over to you, and we're happy to take any questions at any point. So please keep that in mind as we continue this discussion. Rina, I'd like to go back to you, if that's okay, and talk about the industry's challenges. So not on a market basis, but really looking at what the industry can do to scale up supply and accelerate supply in the next few years. Because of course, we've heard a lot about supply chain issues and supply chain bottlenecks that have set in over the last year plus, I would say year and a half. Some of the reasons for this I've mentioned before: the COVID-19 recovery, the industrial shutdowns, some related to COVID, some related to energy supply shortfalls in major economies like China that have created logistics and component bottlenecks in the wind supply chain. How have these events impacted, in your view, and in the view of Vestas, the industry access to some of those key commodities that we need for the wind industry when it comes to our ability to live up to these increasing targets that we're seeing under Repower EU and Inflation Reduction Act? How are we able to step up now in terms of fulfilling the supply question?
I think this question is even a bit more complicated than that, because it's not just access to raw materials, which is going to be a challenge, essentially if we scale up or if we would quadruple installations as we would need to get back on a net zero compatible growth path. But we have to start with looking at the situation of most Western turbine manufacturers that, not just with the current crisis, are having very challenging times. Because inflation of transport, physical bottlenecks, shortages of vessels, containers, that started all long before the Russian attack on Ukraine. And it's now amplified, actually. And the manufacturers have concluded contracts in the times of offshore, usually two years ago, for installations that are done today, and for offshore even longer. Meaning that every manufacturer concluded contracts with their customers on price levels before the inflationary trends started. And in this environment, to scale up investments, it's a very, very tricky situation. This means we would need really political stability, trust that the volumes that are targeted are going to be realized and not stuck in permitting somewhere. And then comes the material question. Is coming a bit later, I would say, because right now we have perhaps some bottlenecks which are causing delays, but there are no physical shortages as such. But if we keep demand increasing for electric vehicles, for grids, for wind turbines, solar panels, whatever else, without opening up new mines, and opening up a mine takes often 10, even over 16 years, then we will face a serious challenge with regards to accelerating the clean energy transition.
So in terms of material shortages, it's more of a mid to long-term horizon that we're looking at. But the current situation is more about delays that are manageable in the short term.
And extra cost, for sure.
And the additional costs given the contracting timelines in the industry, especially for offshore wind. These sessions are designed to be a little shorter, so I'm afraid I only have one final question for both panelists. But before I do ask that question, just a final scan of the audience to see if there are any comments or any questions that folks would like to bring up for either of our panelists. We do have a question from a gentleman in the third row. Please introduce yourself and your organization.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. My name is Robert Dunajewski. I'm part of the Ukrainian team, and I'm representing Katzenbach Engineering Company. I just wanted actually to make a remark, because we've been asked how it would be possible to help Ukraine. I would like to say that there is a number of companies who are there, and we would be glad to have some job or manufacturing or whatsoever in these times, because we have big teams to support at these times. So if there is a shortage, and you can see is a foreign company or foreign for Ukraine, European company, to ask for or to resource some of the services or deliveries to Ukraine, you would definitely would be very welcomed now, because the Ukrainians really need work and jobs now. And also the pricing would be definitely interesting. I understand there are a lot of logistics things, but at least in service and other things, it might be an interesting story to overcome the shortages and would help Ukraine definitely. Thank you. This is a remark, and I hope it's okay in this in this scope. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think it's worth noting again, for those of us with us today, the Ukraine Wind Energy Association booth is just there. So hopefully you'll be able to have some conversations with some of our audience members after the session. So maybe just to have a final wind up, I'd like to ask a question to each panelist, which hopefully ends on a more optimistic note, looking ahead, looking beyond the coming winter, which is when we try to chart a way out of these crises, and again, we're looking at the parallel crises of energy security as well as climate change, which countries seem to be leaning into renewables more heavily, betting on renewables to respond to the crises, and which ones have yet to step up their renewables commitments in light of the crisis. I think, Galina, we can start with you. You had a very strong note about Ukraine, making it clear that wind energy and renewables are about democracy and European energy security.
Yeah,
exactly. But maybe you can put a few more words against that.
Yeah. So if we're talking about Ukraine, as I have already mentioned, it is not possible to discuss, let's say, the future of Ukraine without renewables. The recovery of our economy, for sure, it should and will be based on renewables. Ukraine has huge natural resources: solar, wind, biomass, biogas. We have a lot of water, so we have everything prepared for, let's say, wide-scale employment of renewable powers. And again, I mentioned today, if we're talking about the short period, as I have mentioned today, we have already about 1 gigawatt of wind farms being at different stages of construction before the war. So to resume their construction, it's very, I would say, quite easy, and we can do it in a short period of time. And addition to this 1 gigawatt of wind farms, before the war, we have already about 4 gigawatt of wind capacities that have received already building permit. So also, except the natural resources, we have already done a lot of, let's say, development job just to immediately when the war ends, jump into the roll-up in the wind power in Ukraine.
Thanks, Galina. Rina, over to you.
I think you asked for a positive note. I would say this current energy crisis is somehow a wake-up call for a lot of countries, and a lot of countries are raising their ambitions. You can see the raise of the offshore targets. What was the number you mentioned earlier in a session this morning, from 140 gigawatts to now over 2,000 gigawatts by 2050. It's incredible. So countries are definitely grasping the potential that renewables can bring to them, not only with regards to being independent from fossil fuel imports, but also geopolitical disruptions, etc. The question is just now how to scale up fast and very, very quick.
Great.
Could I just add 1-2 sentences? Renewables and wind energy, this is a real technology of freedom and independence. And for sure, this is the technology for peace. So if humanity wants to live in future, I would say, it will really is going to help and our planet. For sure, we have no other options as to develop renewables and wind as a priority.
Certainly, I think it's what we call the no regrets solution to the crisis, is to invest in wind energy.
Yes.
And I think we've heard from both of you today about the investable pipelines of wind projects in Ukraine and globally. We've heard that there's ambitious targets, but of course to reach these targets, we need reforms, we need some immediate measures to stabilize the situation around energy security, including energy efficiency. And we hope for continued safety and stability for our colleagues in Ukraine who are struggling every day with the maintenance issue around electricity infrastructure, and hoping that this situation remains stable through the winter. But we will stay in close touch with the Ukraine Wind Energy Association to continue support and communication there.
Yeah.
So
thank you, Joyce.
Thank you so much for joining us for this session. We hope you found it informative and eye-opening. Please do join me in thanking our two panelists, Galina from the Ukraine Wind Energy Association and Rina from Vestas, for sharing their thoughts and their time with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.